Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. However, I step into the batter's box with the two-strike count. Strike one, no jokes. Strike two, a code in my node. But yet, all may still be well because I can hit a curveball. My topic, as announced, is reading with Lincoln is very broad, but I've decided to concentrate today on Lincoln's love of Shakespeare, and more particularly on his passion, strange passion, for Macbeth. I'll be happy, of course, to entertain comments on any aspect of Lincoln's reading once we arrive at the question and comment stage. At the back of William Scott's Lessons in Elocution, first published in England in 1779, on facing pages, if we could now have the second slide, on facing pages are two speeches from Shakespeare's Hamlet that Lincoln came to know by heart. King Claudius's "Oh, my offenses rank," on the murder of his brother, Prince Hamlet's father, and the prince's much more famous soliloquy, "To be or not to be." As a boy in Indiana, perhaps even before his teens, Lincoln had had the opportunity to read and study Scott's popular anthology, a volume that Sarah Bush Johnston was said to have brought with her to Indiana when she married Tom Lincoln in 1819. While Scott's lessons may or may not have been the boy Lincoln's first encounter with Shakespeare, it is a striking coincidence that these two passages from Hamlet would figure publicly in his presidential life more than 40 years later. In 1863, the American Shakespearean actor James H. Hackett made two sets of appearances at Washington theaters, performing as Falstaff in Henry IV and the Merry Wives of Windsor. Lincoln, who loved the theater, as we've seen from the previous talk, is known to have attended 4 of these shows, 1 in March and 3 in December. Soon after his March 14th performance, presumably aware that the president had been in attendance and in an attempt to curry favor with Lincoln, Hackett sent him a copy of his just-published book, Notes and Comments upon Certain Plays and Actors of Shakespeare. While it is doubtful that Lincoln ever got around to reading the book, he did belatedly send Hackett a note of thanks for the gift. In his letter, Lincoln rather unguardedly spoke of his love for but incomplete reading of the plays. Some of Shakespeare's plays I have never read, while others I have gone over perhaps as frequently as any unprofessional reader. Among the latter are Lear, Richard III, Henry VIII, Hamlet, and especially Macbeth. I think nothing equals Macbeth. It is wonderful. Unlike you gentlemen of the profession, I think the soliloquy in Hamlet commencing, "Oh, my offenses rank," surpasses that commencing, "To be or not to be." But pardon this small attempt at criticism. This might have been the end of the matter had not Hackett, in an act of unconscionable self-promotion, printed a broadside of Lincoln's letter and handed it around. Though the broadside cautioned that it was not for publication, but for private distribution only, inevitably Lincoln's political enemies got hold of copies and commenced sneering at the president for his poor taste in Shakespearean soliloquies. The irony was that Lincoln had very probably studied the text of Hamlet far more thoroughly than any of his critics, and his preference for Claudius's speech over Hamlet's resulted from mature critical reflection. The world might not have agreed with him, but no one who knew Lincoln's possessive attitude toward poetry he loved could honestly say that he hadn't thought the matter through. Characteristically, Lincoln responded mildly, even stoically, to Hackett's lèse majesté. "My note to you I certainly did not expect to see in print, yet I have not been much shocked by the newspaper comments upon it. Those comments constitute a fair specimen of what has occurred to me through life. I have endured a great deal of ridicule without much malice, and have received a great deal of kindness, not quite free from ridicule. I am used to it. Ridicule with or without malice notwithstanding, Lincoln would hold to his unconventional taste, for he knew what he liked because he liked what he knew. But why did he prefer Claudius to the prince? Generations of readers have praised To Be or Not to Be as among the very greatest of dramatic poetry, and the morality of the two speeches is also in favor of the prince. Hamlet, after all, is suffering because he has not done murder, his uncle because he has. The obvious reason for Lincoln's preference is that the words of the usurping fratricide somehow meant more to him. But again, why? Since he did not say, any speculation would necessarily require a sound understanding of his psychology, the achievement of which has proved a most difficult matter for Lincoln's legion of biographers. Still, we may risk a few tentative observations. Take a deep breath before observing anything about Lincoln's psychology, but here we go. First and foremost, Claudius speaks of his corroding, crippling guilt, a topic always fascinating to Lincoln, whose emotional sensitivity and surpassing imagination enabled him, if it did not condemn him, to envision another's sins and the consequent guilt. Claudius, like Macbeth, murdered his kinsman and his king. Lincoln obviously did no such thing. Claudius, again like Macbeth, writhed in agony over a heinous wrong he could neither accept in himself nor repent of. And here we may compare Macbeth's speech before the regicide in Act 1, Scene 7. Lincoln, lacking the sinful act, had no need of repentance, but he felt guilt. For deep and obscure reasons, he seemed to identify with the guilty, especially those who had done their bloody deeds from the prickings of outsized ambition. Both illegitimate Shakespearean kings speak similarly of their suffering, unmitigated because their sins cannot be atoned. Both are aware of ambition as the first cause of their falls. Here's Claudius. I am still possessed of those effects for which I did the murder, my crown, mine own ambition, and my queen. And here Macbeth. I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition, which o'erleaps itself and falls on t'other. By these standards, it is fair to say that Prince Hamlet has no ambition, and therefore he is less interesting to Lincoln, who was deeply infected. To recall Lord Bacon's warning, and I might digress here to say that one of the things I argue for in this same chapter is that Lincoln did read Bacon's essays. To recall Lord Bacon's warning, ambition is a desire and therefore irrational, though it can be rationalized, and desires will out. All that reason can manage is to make ambition's outcomes less than wholly destructive to the leader whose will to power has been loosed upon the Commonwealth, which stands to gain so long as its prince's ambition is channeled by his reason and a little checked by the state. Lincoln never committed patricide upon the United States of America, as one of the psychobiographers has charged, but he did feel guilt and responsibility for the unprecedented carnage of the Civil War. His ambition had put him in the presidency, and the result was that hundreds of thousands of young men died. The logic of this connection is fallacious, of course, post hoc ergo propter hoc, but that might not have stopped Lincoln's conscience from self-blame. He had had the will, then he got the power, finally the disasters of war began. To call Lincoln a good mimic is to finally undervalue the quality of his histrionic gift. He was an impersonator. And though he would never say so, with Shakespearean characters, he could have competed with the likes of Hackett and other gentlemen of the profession. Francis Carpenter, the painter who resided in the White House for several months in 1864 while working on his great canvas, The First Reading of the Emancipation Proclamation, now and then provided an audience of one for Lincoln's Shakespearean impersonations. Carpenter, in his memoir called 6 Months at the White House, 1866, vividly recalled an extended sitting for the painting on March the 2nd, 1864. And I quote, "Presently the conversation turned on Shakespeare, and more particularly upon Hamlet. Lincoln said, 'There is one passage of the play of Hamlet which is very apt to be slurred over by the actor or omitted altogether, which seems to me the choicest part of the play. It is the soliloquy of the king after the murder. It always struck me as one of the finest touches of nature in the world,' end quote. Continuing quote. Then, Carpenter continues, throwing himself into the very spirit of the scene, he took up the words, 'Oh, my offense is rank.' Hearing the entire speech, recited from memory, and done so powerfully, overwhelmed Carpenter. Lincoln spoke, quote, 'with a feeling and appreciation unsurpassed by anything I ever witnessed upon the stage.' That same evening, Lincoln went to Grover's Theater to watch Edwin Booth in Hamlet. Another evening during that same winter of 63-64, Lincoln, accompanied by his journalist confidant Noah Brooks, went to Ford's Theater to watch some Shakespeare. They slipped in through the stage door and entered one of the stage boxes without being seen by the audience. As Brooks recalled, the two of them took their seats in a box directly under the one in which he was afterwards assassinated. The president being throughout the performance in a remarkable flow of spirits and making many comical remarks on the progress of the play. From their private vantage, they watched Edwin Booth as Shylock in The Merchant of Venice. As is well known, this is a Shakespearean drama far too dark to be easily experienced as a comedy, in the usual sense of the term, though it was so classified in the first folio of 1623 and sometimes still is. It is true that for the young Italian romantic couples of Merchant, the action indeed proves to have been much ado about little, for they triumph over the Jewish usurer and are poised to live happily ever after at the close of the play. But Shylock, rather than getting his comic comeuppance, is tragically reduced and becomes pitiful in the audience's eyes. His large fortune forfeited to the state, his daughter married to a Gentile, and he himself forced to convert to Christianity. As Brooks and Lincoln strolled from the theater afterward, Lincoln observed, "It was a good performance, but I would 1,000 times rather read it at home if it were not for Booth's playing. A farce or a comedy is best played, a tragedy is best read at home." The implications of this intriguing statement are clear. Lincoln regarded The Merchant of Venice as a tragedy, not a comedy. He believed that tragedies were better experienced in personal space than seen socially, and that theatrical performance could actually diminish the cathartic power of a great tragedy. Such provocative views, if publicly known, might well have brought down upon him the same derision as had the public revelation of his predilection in Hamlet's soliloquies. Fortunately, Brooks was more discreet than had been Hackett. He did not reveal the episode at Ford's until 1877. Yet once again, and strikingly, Lincoln's critical judgment transcended conventional wisdom. That tragedy was best when read or recited has support in Aristotle's Poetics, while his reclassification of The Merchant of Venice as a tragedy seems today to be familiar and right. As in politics, so in poetry. Lincoln probed more deeply. Lincoln's tally of the Shakespearean dramas he had gone over frequently is surprisingly short when we think of those long-gone idyllic days on the banks of the Sangamon River, reading Shakespeare and Burns with Jack Kelso. One or the other, probably Kelso, carried a volume of Shakespeare, but after a while, the twain may have needed no book at all, reciting to one another passage after favorite passage, almost in the manner of a Western contest that continued until Jack or Abe called hold enough. Fanciful, certainly, though not impossible, if what he wrote to Hackett is true. Lincoln's partial Shakespeare is notable for what is not on the list. No romances. And isn't it a shame that he apparently did not know The Tempest? and among the comedies, only The Merchant of Venice, The Merry Wives of Windsor. That leaves the major tragedies and histories, and what we might term the tragic histories, such as King John and Richard II and III. Critic and historian Matthew Pinsker believes that Lincoln's mature preferences in Shakespeare derived largely from his own involvement as leader during a time of revolutionary tumult. I quote, "Naturally, many of the Shakespearean plays and passages Lincoln seemed to admire most dwelled on themes of rebellion, usurpation, and ambition run amok. The historical dramas that he quoted from so freely, such as the plays about the House of York and the House of Lancaster, vied for control of the nation. The tragedies he preferred, like Macbeth or Hamlet, concerned the nature of evil and civil disorder created by disruption in the succession of kings." Concerning the history plays, especially the Henrys, Pinsker is convincing. But the tragedies pose deeper interpretive challenges. What reader, audience member, or critic comes away from an experience of Macbeth understanding the nature of evil? That the gallant and heroic warrior Macbeth, at the outset of the drama, a well-regarded man of both bonhomie and arete, rapidly becomes a moral monster until by Act 5, or even before, we desire his death both for the sake of the kingdom of Scotland and for his own sake. This is not to isolate and define evil, but to wonder at its incomprehensible reality. That evil exists, that Lincoln could mutter to himself, "There but for the grace of God go I," and that unperceived grace, in Lincoln's theology, the unknowable will of God, might be removed at any moment. These were the solemn affirmations of tragic catharsis, a realm of knowledge more felt than thought. Lincoln, besides performing, sometimes served as his own dramaturg. On the same occasion that the painter Carpenter heard and was moved by, "Oh, my offenses rank," the president followed his recitation with a brief seminar on the proper way to deliver the lines with which Richard III opens. "Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York, and all the clouds that lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried." In Lincoln's view, actors and directors too often entirely misapprehended the tenor of these verses. "It is quite common," he instructed Carpenter, "for an actor to come upon the stage and in a sophomoric style to begin with the flourish," and here he spoke the speech in such a sophomoric way. Now this is all wrong. Richard, you remember, had been and was then plotting the destruction of his brothers to make room for himself. Outwardly the most loyal to the newly crowned king, secretly he could scarcely contain his impatience at the obstacles still in the way of his own elevation. He appears upon the stage just after the crowning of Edward, burning with repressed hate and jealousy. The prologue is the utterance of the most intense bitterness and satire. Having made his director's note clear, Lincoln then changed hats and, unconsciously assuming the character, impersonated from memory the then Duke of Gloucester in his entire 40-line opening soliloquy. Carpenter was awed. The speech was delivered, quote, "with a degree of force and power that made it seem like a new creation to me. Though familiar with the passage from boyhood, I can truly say that never till that moment had I fully appreciated its spirit. I could not refrain from laying down my palette and brushes and applauding heartily." In Carpenter's finished painting, the president is seated a little left of center, his right hand on the arm of a chair, looking out of the frame at a slight angle. Was this his attitude during the performance that day? Not being able to bow from such a posture, did Lincoln acknowledge his audience's approval with a nod of the head? In any case, with a quick brushstroke of flattery, the admiring painter told Lincoln that he had missed his calling, which was just wrong enough considerably to amuse the great emancipator. Then, too, he could be part of his own audience and deeply affected. On May the 11th, 1862, while at Fortress Monroe, Virginia, on military business, Lincoln took a reading break and asked for a copy of Shakespeare. This was supplied by a staff officer, Colonel LeGrand B. Canon, whom the president requested to remain. He read, quote, "He read from Macbeth, Lear, and finally King John, and in reading the passage where Constance bewails the loss of her child to the king, I noticed that he was deeply moved and his voice trembled. And Father Cardinal, I have heard you say that we shall see and know our friends in heaven. If that be true, I shall see my boy again. Grief fills the room up of my absent child, lies in his bed, walks up and down with me, puts on his pretty looks, repeats his words, remembers me of all his gracious parts, stuffs out his vacant garments with his form, then I have reason to be fond of grief." William Wallace Lincoln had died on February the 20th at the age of 11. Willie was perhaps his father's favorite among the four Lincoln sons, and his death after a sudden illness overwhelmed both the president and Mary Todd Lincoln. 3 months later, Lincoln still carried an immense burden of grief, though characteristically hidden, or for the most part hidden. Colonel Canon witnessed its power that day at Fortress Monroe, called forth by Lincoln's utterance of Constance's speech. Quote, he said, "Did you ever dream of a lost friend and feel that you were having a direct communion with that friend, and yet a consciousness that it was not a reality?" My reply was, "Yes, I think we all may have had such an experience." He replied, "So do I dream of my boy Willie." He was utterly overcome. His great frame shook, and bowing down on the table, he wept as only such a man in the breaking down of a great sorrow could weep. Together with the contradictories of fatality and guilt, personal grief and political military disillusionment forced Lincoln towards the end of the war in his life to the brink of a nihilism that not even the joking of his beloved literary comedians could prevent. Such humor now tended to exacerbate the tragedy rather than lighten it, much as the punning of the drunken porter in Macbeth only deepens the gloom around Dunsinane. As Carpenter remembered, during the first week of the battles of the Wilderness, he scarcely slept at all. Had he, by some twisted logic in his deep but troubled mind, murdered sleep? The editor of the Philadelphia Press, John Forney, who happened to be present when the president received the first casualty reports from Grant in Virginia, heard him cry mercy, my God, over 20,000 men killed and wounded in a few days. I cannot bear it. I cannot bear it." It seems that had Mary Todd Lincoln herself suddenly perished at that moment, Lincoln, like Macbeth, might have blankly said, "She should have died hereafter." He was to that degree distracted. One evening, Forney came to the White House, where he found the president ghastly pale, with dark rings under his caverned eyes. Lincoln was reading Shakespeare. This Shakespeare. Tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. He took this text, he explained to Forney, for consolation. 11 months later, the war was won for the Union. Lincoln, though vastly relieved, but did not necessarily feel better about life in a metaphysical sense. On his last trip into Virginia, to City Point and beyond, into Petersburg and the fallen Confederate capital, Richmond, Lincoln continued to have Shakespeare and especially Macbeth on his mind. Some lines of the usurping kings spoken to Lady Macbeth soon after the regicide kept occurring to Lincoln. But let the frame of things disjoint, both the worlds suffer, ere we will eat our meal in fear, and sleep in the afflictions of these terrible dreams that shake us nightly. Better be with the dead, whom we to gain our peace have sent to peace, than on the torture of the mind to lie in restless ecstasy. Duncan is in his grave. After life's fitful fever, he sleeps well. Treason has done his worst. Nor steel, nor poison, malice domestic, foreign, levy, nothing can touch him further. On Sunday, April 9th, during the upriver return of the River Queen from City Point, the Marquis de Champlain recalled that during the day, the conversation turned on literary subjects, and the president favored the company with readings for several hours, mostly from Shakespeare, especially Macbeth, and more particularly the lines after the murder of Duncan, when the new king falls a prey to moral torment. This speech, Champlain emphasized, was dramatically dwelt on. Now and then Lincoln paused to expatiate on how exact a picture Shakespeare here gives of a murderer's mind. When the dark deed achieved, its perpetrator already envies his victim's calm sleep. He read the scene over twice. Lincoln possessed the same kind of eidetic imagination as Macbeth, one to which present fears are less than horrible imaginings. The former were diminished, if not vanished, by April 1865, but horrible imaginings ceased only with death, when the imaginer was in his grave, at last sleeping well. Another passenger on the River Queen, Senator Charles Sumner, also listened to Lincoln on that occasion and remembered the president holding, quote, a beautiful quarto Shakespeare in his hands, end quote. For what was likely his final reading of Shakespeare, Abraham Lincoln possessed a fine copy in a fine binding, a correlative of his rise from circuit lawyer in Illinois, carrying a cheap, worn, dog-eared Shakespeare, to prince or king or president of the United States, whose last books were gilt, even as the Gilded Age began. Thank you.
Would you say that this passion for Shakespeare is the main reason for his developing ability as one of the great presidential speechwriters of all time, or are there some other books or that he may have read that may have added to that?
Very interesting question, one that I have tried to address in reading with Lincoln. In principle, I think Lincoln developed his education this way, especially after he became a man and identified his life's ambition. That is, judge early in a book whether it will be of any use to you as a politician. A political artist is the term I use. If so, take that material from that book and do what Herndon called assimilate it to your being. That was what he often said about Lincoln's reading. If not, don't bother with it, except insofar as you had to, if it were a legal treatise, for example, or something business-related like trigonometry, which is always a great read for surveying. Now, when it came to Shakespeare, I think it's fair to say that Lincoln did not really use Shakespeare in any obvious way in his speeches and writings. Rhythms, syntax sometimes, but direct quotation or other use of Shakespeare and Shakespearean plays, very rare in the public Lincoln. I think Shakespeare existed mainly for him as a cathartic place to go when life was overwhelming. And I think this developed sense of the tragic that Shakespeare manifests in an unparalleled way in the history of Western literature was something that was able to help him as no other book could. Now, the books that did help him become the greatest presidential speechwriter of all time, as you put it. By the way, Doug Wilson's Lincoln's Sword is the place to go to understand just how Lincoln used this stuff. The Bible, for example, and I'll just give that one example, and we can go into other things later in conversation, was almost always used by Lincoln, the political artist, rather than for any kind of meditation in private. And the same thing could be said for a number of other texts, but again, better not try and go into that at this point. Thank you.
I want to thank you for your talk. The lines from Macbeth that I've always felt were actually even more apt for Lincoln as time went on was, I am steeped in blood so deep that to go back or forward, the concept that going back would be as tedious as go war. Yeah. And I was always struck by that in terms of that. As a psychiatrist, with always the cautions that one cannot speculate to the extent that you can, it is interesting that people have usually, which you have not, I think very beautifully, focused on the regicide concept, as opposed to the fact that, if I'm not mistaken, Macbeth, which I do believe is the greatest tragedy, is also the shortest and in many ways the bloodiest. And certainly the aptness of the experience for Lincoln, who had to send men to die, and was steeped so deep. I wonder if you can comment on that, because I believe that was the power, and in a strange way, among the most nihilistic speeches, yet he found it among the most comforting, dealing with the death of his own son and the death of many other sons. I wonder if you can comment on that.
Well, I doubt that I can comment on it with the kind of aptness that you stated it, but I will try. In some ways, I am so far steeped in blood speech that Macbeth gives midpoint in his in creating the river of blood is a macabre and tragic version of, well, let's don't change horses in the middle of the stream. And I had never put that together the way that you just did, and I'm very grateful for that, because it does seem to me that it helps us explain one of the most nearly inexplicable aspects of Lincoln, and that is his immensely heroic capability to carry on when almost anybody else would have been destroyed by the duty that he faced. Yes, thanks.
I have a question that might be a little bit from left field, but I'm going to risk it because I think it would have intrigued Lincoln. The huge debate about who authored Shakespeare's plays is not about the name of an individual, but it's about the nature of the person who could have written the plays. And with your own background, if you've ever thought about it, in terms of choosing between this fellow from Avon and someone who knew the ways of courts and the hearts of princes, what do you think he would have chosen, or you yourself?
Well, with two strikes on me, I choke up. And become a spray hitter rather than left field. But I will say just one thing about that. I'm in no position to argue either for or against Will of Avon as the author of the plays. But I will tell you that one of the things that surprised me the most as I prepared the bibliography and engaged in writing the book, that I came to believe that Henry C. Whitney was right in suggesting that Lincoln read Lord Bacon. And once I myself settled in with those essays, I found one essay after another, one sentence after another, that really did seem to ramify in the way that other people have said Lincoln thought, felt, and acted. And if you put Bacon up there as a possibility for the authorship of the plays, among many others, I don't even know if he's in the top 5, but it is interesting that Lincoln would have felt that the prosaic advice of Bacon, even though stated rather quaintly from time to time, almost like the British Machiavel, who really did understand from the inside out how power worked in institutions, and by the way was tripped up by that understanding. Whitney also says that Lincoln did not hold it against Whitney for taking bribes. And now that sounds funny until you realize that what Lincoln meant by that was it didn't affect his decisions. Yes, he took the bribes, but he did the right thing, and sometimes going against the very people who were bribing him. I'm afraid that's about all I've got to say on that one.
Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Bray, thank you for your wonderful presentation. I am a Lincoln lover, but amateur, very, very passionate about it. Is there any evidence with his reading from Bacon and, as you emphasize, the Bible and Shakespeare, how did he get this in to begin with? Was he late at night? Is he an Edison type, or is that known? Or likewise, how much was his shaping due to his conversations and interactions with other scholars?
Almost entirely self-taught, from the learning of the ABCs to the last speech that he wrote and gave. Abraham Lincoln blazed his own trail. Now, he was also a good listener, as well as a selective, deep if selective reader. But all along, he seemed somehow with an unfailing intuition to be able to find those texts that would help him grow intellectually. And I think there's something to be said for not reading as much as scholars typically do. Now, or even some ways public people generally typically do, because indiscriminate reading is basically mental confusion. I find it myself in my professional life and in also my recreational reading. For example, when I look at, I like to read recreatively crime fiction, but I have started a book I've read more than once. And I don't, Lincoln would never have done that, because for him, as Herndon said, he would assimilate it to his being, or he'd throw it off, throw it aside. And I think that's how he deepened, even as he did not broaden his educated sense of himself.
Yeah, thank you.
Dr. Bray, thank you. More of a comment than a question. I'm fortunate to be employed at the Rare Book Room of the Library of Congress, and your talk was particularly poignant to me because we have, among other holdings, we have indeed Lincoln's letter to James Hackett of August 1863, and we have his follow-up note, which I think is also striking, of November 22nd, 1863. And to my embarrassment, and you mentioned Doug Wilson, to my embarrassment, Doug asked me a question in recent weeks about trying to locate the copy of Notes on Shakespeare that Hackett had sent to Lincoln, which started the whole process. And I didn't know if it still existed. Well, I started to do some checking in the library catalogs and found that we did have one copy assigned in our regular rare book holdings, but there was no mention of an inscription or any provenance. So when I actually checked the book out, there on the title page was, with respects to President Lincoln, signed James Hackett. So,
wow.
So if any of you have a particular interest in Lincoln and Shakespeare and you are visiting the Rare Book Room, I welcome you to come, and hopefully I can show one or more of these items to you. The only thing we lack in the whole tale, the broadside that Hackett had printed of the original letter, we don't have a copy of that at the Library of Congress, but on subsequent research we find out that the University of Illinois and the University of Iowa have copies. A final point, so occasionally we will have thespians visit the Rare Book Room, and as an afterthought, sometimes we think about showing the Lincoln Hackett letter. And I can tell you that whenever we do that, that's always the hit of the presentation. I know Deanna Rigg, Liam Neeson, other actors I could mention have seen the letter, and it literally brings tears to the eyes. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lincoln read no fiction. I don't know whether that's true or not, but more than one of his biographers have said so. Yet he knew Shakespeare as well as any president, and he attended the theater. I'm wondering what is to make of this. I mean, I'm inclined to be mistrustful of people who only read nonfiction. Or maybe you found...
Yeah, just as many people are of people who read only fiction, yeah. Which comes closer to describing me, I suppose. Well, Lincoln is said to have said that himself. I believe it goes like this: I never read a novel all the way through, which is slightly different. There's some little evidence that he read some short stories by Carolyn Lee Hens called Mob Cap and Other Stories, but he didn't read much biography either, because he thought that the vaunted egotism of both autobiography and biography were forms of untruth. And perhaps he had that old Protestant notion that so is fiction. But that won't work when you think about drama, because drama was proscribed, as we heard in that very funny anecdote in the first talk about the Rev claiming that Lincoln never liked the theater. What's to mistrust? Maybe you could follow up on your own point of view there for me. What's to mistrust about a person who doesn't read fiction?
Well, it's basically what you were saying, that one, for the same reason one would be mistrustful of someone who only read fiction, the lack of balance, that's all.
I think, if I could just venture nothing but a speculation here, Abraham Lincoln seems to have liked running things through in his head. And I think dramatic scenes work much better that way than, say, fictional scenes, or in fact any kind of prose scenes. The other thing that he did the most of in his head was poetry. And so dramatic poetry would be the confluence, really, of the two things that he admired the most in literature.
Did Lincoln read anything about science or mathematics?
Yes, he had to be a practical trigonometrician in order to get his surveying license. So he went through algebra and post-algebra and trigonometry textbooks, and apparently learned all he needed to know in order to become certified, or at least employable, as a surveyor. But other than that, Euclid's geometry was one of the things that he kind of puffed himself up about that, reading the first 6 or 12 books of Euclid. But that's really other than the arithmetics of his youth, that's all I know about Lincoln and mathematics.
And how about science? Did he read anything about science?
Oh, he loved science, and there was an annual publication of developments in science that he back during the Herndon-Lincoln Law Office years, some indication that he read it every year when it came out. And we all know about his lecture on inventions and discoveries. Apparently now one in the same lecture, though he gave it in different venues and for a long time. And in the collected works, it says that it's 2. But I believe that Wayne Temple has shown that it's 1. And in there, he has a striking sort of period near the end of the lecture in which he talks about how wonderful it would be if we could harness the wind. And I've made a poster of that based on a photograph that I took of our new wind farm west of town in Bloomington, Illinois, lineated his words. And it's really quite striking, his sense of how much wind power could, practical science, to a lesser extent theoretical science, maybe even a tinge of metaphysics now and then.
And did he ever read Uncle Tom's Cabin?
Not that I'm aware of. I know that there's an apocryphal story about Harriet Beecher Stowe in the White House. If it's not apocryphal, I know that she did meet Lincoln, but the story is what might be apocryphal, that he said, so you're the little woman that made this great big war? Yeah. I don't know if that's got provenance or not, but it sure is a great story, isn't it?
Thank you.
Fiction. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.